We're going to take a look at selecting this lion here that we have in the foreground. And our subject presents some challenges because he's very hairy here around the mane. So we'll start off just by building a very basic selection. And I'm just going to zoom out here a little bit just so we can see him in all his glory. And I want to select the lion plus the rock that he's standing on. I'm going to place them in another context. Now, we begin by using either the selection tool, the lasso, or we can use the quick select method, which is kind of a painterly approach. I prefer using the lasso. Probably the best way to deal with a lion, I would think, or just avoid them altogether. So I just start building a selection, and I can just build it a little bit at a time, being careful to avoid the areas that are disputed. Those are the areas where you're not quite sure if it's background or if it's hair. So I'm just going to avoid those entirely. And remember, when you're building a selection, holding down the Shift key allows you to add to it. And if you've accidentally selected some questionable areas, so let's say I selected that by mistake, of course you could say Command Z, but you could also subtract, Option key for that. So Option key to subtract, Shift key to add. Okay? And so in this fashion, you'll build a selection that will encompass the lion and the rock that he's standing on. Now, in areas where there's a very clearly defined boundary between the subject and the background, hold down the Shift key, I want to go fairly close. And in areas, of course, like the mane, I want to give a little bit of distance because I don't want to mess it with this sort of disputed area here. I'm going to let Photoshop figure that out using its edge detection technology. So I don't want to go too close. I want to give Photoshop a little bit of creative license to figure out where that boundary actually exists. Now, once you've got that selection built, I'm just going to zoom out here, you should probably save that selection. And you can do that in the selection menu. So if you go to select, you can save your selection. I've already got one that I've saved from earlier, and I just called it Lion Rough. Click OK, and it's loaded that selection in. And you can see the marching ants there. So now that we've got that, we can then move over to using the select and mask function, which you can see right here. And click on it. And you'll notice that it defaults to using what we call the onion skin. It allows us to partially see the background. There's transparency on it. And the foreground subject, the selected area, is at 100%. Now you can change these view modes here in the Properties panel. You can go to more classic arrangements. You can look at the mask itself. You can look at the marching ants. The old quick selection overlay or ruby lith, which comes from classic darkroom technique, on a black background, on white background, or on layers. I prefer to use this onion skin methodology, and it allows me to see what's going on. So again, we've got a number of edge detection things to work with, and when we use edge detection, we can predetermine a radius in which Photoshop will look for differences. That's what an edge is. If you look at the snow, there are no differences. There are no edges. It's only when we get up here near the rock or up here near the edge of the forest that there's a significant shift in either value or hue. So we start to see pixels of a different color. Photoshop's able to analyze the pixels in the image and look for these transition boundaries. It's very simple for those areas that have very clear demarcations in terms of their color or their value. For instance, between the edge of the line and the snow, that's very straightforward and easy for Photoshop to select. But in areas where there's a great deal of similarity, like up here at the top of the mane and where this tree is, it can be quite challenging. If you were to do this on your own, it would take quite a bit of time. However, selecting an edge detection radius really depends on the type of image that you have. If you've got a very clearly demarked edge, a much smaller radius is required, and this tells Photoshop basically, look within this search perimeter for differences. Now, in cases where we have very complex hair, that small perimeter simply isn't going to cut it. And so you would need a much larger search perimeter in order for Photoshop to adequately analyze those areas and look for differences or edges. We can use Smart Radius, and this allows Photoshop the discretion to set the radius for that edge detection boundary. We can do global refinements. We can look at some of those in order to see those. I'm just going to turn this to black and white, and under global refinements we can smooth out our selections. You can see it changing there. This can be very handy for low resolution images where you can actually see what we would call the jagged edge or the rasterizing or aliasing of the edges where the pixels can actually be seen. We can smooth that out. Feathering, of course, gives us a dissipated or ghosted edge where our image dissipates to 0% very gradually. And contrast really is almost like the opposite of feathering. If I just increase the feathering here and we ramp up the contrast, we go from allowing areas of gray, that soft ghosted edge, to a very sharply defined boundary. So contrast is the measure of difference between the lightest area of an image and the darkest area of an image. And so I'm just going to leave these things back at their original settings. And we can also shift the edge of that boundary outwards or inwards. And that can be handy for images that have what we call little edge halos. Slight different, it could be due to lighting, where we get a very light kind of white halo around an object. But again, I'm going to set that to 0 for now. There's also a thing here that allows for decontamination of colors. And if you actually examine the legs of the line up close, the decontamination might be a good thing to use because the line has a slight magenta hue to the legs. And you know, if you're a detail-oriented person and you're looking in there, you'll notice that just along this boundary there's a slight aura of purple or magenta. So these are some of the things that we can allow Photoshop to work with, to automate, and then we can do it ourselves. So here we're kind of helping Photoshop out, and right now we're using what's called the Refine Edge Brush. So I'm just going to create it at a certain size. Let me just zoom out here a little bit. And in this area, I want to make sure the brush is large enough to accommodate that edge. And I'm just brushing it in. And you'll notice that Photoshop is automatically finding the very fine details in the hair. You can see that right there as I paint along. Now I'm going to use, there we go. Just going to paint along that edge there. Along this edge. The inner edge. It's actually doing a very superb job of locating the edges of the hair. And I'll just do the inside of the thighs there. tail detail. There we go. And I want to just end up right back where I started. And again, I can make another pass of this if I wanted to. But that looks pretty good. Now, if you want to just see this, let's go to black and white, and you can see that it's got all this edge information. Now, it may not have nailed it 100%, in which case we can help it out here by using this tool to paint in areas that have been left out. So you can see I can just help to more sharply define those edges. And here it's painting in white. So I'm just cleaning up that mask so that the areas where you would see the gray, partial background would show through. And that's not something we want. So we just want the outer silhouette. No sort of inner edges are of an interest to us. And so just work our way through that. And again, just going to make this a little bit smaller. Wherever there were gray areas, like I said, it would impart a certain degree of transparency to the foreground subject, and we don't want that. And I'll just finish painting that. And so while Photoshop seems to have done an amazing job there on the areas where we have the hair, it's actually detected some inner hair edges on the animal itself, and that's not really what we're concerned with. We're concerned with the outer edge and separating the subject from the background. We're not trying to do any sort of internal separation, and so we just got to clean that up. But Photoshop did most of the heavy lifting on that edge. And now it's just a simple paint job on the inside. Again, I'm using the left bracket here just to make this a little bit smaller. Oh, Command Z. It's often advisable to paint a little bit at a time so that if you do make a mistake when you Command Z, you're not going all the way back to the beginning when you started the touch-up process. Now, I'm going to hold down the Option key because that's going to give me black paint so I can fill these areas in here. So just holding that down, just got a little bit confused. Bringing in a little bit of the background there, and we don't want that. And those might be in areas where the hair is very similar color to what we might have in the background trees. So just touch that up a little bit. I'm pretty good with how that looks right now. And so we'll go back to the onion skin mode. There we go. And now we're ready to output it. Now, just before I output it, I'm going to say decontaminate the colors. And now I'll just click OK. And we have options here of what we want it to do. We can create a new layer, a new document with a layer mask in it. I just want a new layer with a layer mask. So that's how we're going to output it. We click OK. And you'll notice that it generated a brand new layer with the layer mask. So now that we have that, I'm just going to separate this tab. I'm just going to tear it off. We can now drag that lion into its new environment. And there's our lion. It's a little bit small here. So typically we don't want to scale things up. So probably I should be scaling that background down, to be perfectly honest. So perhaps we'll go in the opposite direction. And what I'll do is revert this file so it's back to its original form. And this time we'll drag the background across. And now it's for me to reduce that background. I'm just going to zoom out. Just close this file so it's not too confusing. And I'm just, again, going to dock the image. You see the blue outline there? I'm just docking the image so it fills up the workspace. And now, if I just zoom out, spacebar, Command, Option, and now I can do Command T to transform. I can just scale that background image down, and I should actually make sure that background image, if we look over here on the Layers panel, that it's behind the lion and the mask. First of all, let me just get it into range for size. I suppose I could title this one Sea Lion. Okay, that's close enough. And now let's change the layering. And now we've got our lion. Now, if we can do anything, it's scale it down. Now you can see how nicely the hair is integrating with the background. Maybe some issues over here that I could touch up a little bit later, but they might be insignificant by the time I scale this down. But you can see it's done a nice job of decontaminating most of the color on the edge of that leg. And again, spacebar, Command, Option, and Command T, but this time I want to scale down the lion. So I select the layer with the lion on it, Command T. Now we're scaling down that lion, just so that he looks like he's there underwater, enjoying himself, being photographed by these divers. Okay, I can double click that now if I feel that that's kind of got us where we need to be under the sea. There we go. Double click it. Okay, the next thing we need to look at is scene balancing. Clearly the lighting situation that the lion was in was very different from that in which he'd be if he were actually underwater. The lighting has a very definite blue hue or color cast to it, whereas he was shot under very natural lighting conditions in open air. So we need to account for that difference. We need to make him look like he belongs down there. And that's going to require doing some layer adjustments. And we'll come back to that in just a second.